It weighed 4.5 pounds. It was longer than a man's forearm, kicked like a mule, and on a bad day the cylinder could blow apart in your hand. It was, for the better part of a century, the most powerful repeating handgun on the face of the earth. And it very nearly was never built at all. This is the story of a failed inventor, a dying ranger, and the 4.5-pound revolver that saved them both. In 1836, a 22-year-old showman named Samuel Colt patented a firearm with a revolving cylinder, a pistol that could fire 5 shots without reloading, at a time when nearly every gun on Earth fired 1. He built a factory in Paterson, New Jersey, and called it the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company. The gun it made became known as the Colt Paterson. It was a marvel, and it was a commercial disaster. The Army wasn't interested. Civilians found it fragile and complicated. By 1842, the company was bankrupt, the factory was shuttered, and Samuel Colt, the man whose name would one day be a synonym for the American revolver, was out of the gun business entirely. But a few hundred of those failed pistols had drifted south, into the hands of a company of Texas Rangers. June 8, 1844. Near a stream northwest of present-day Sisterdale, Texas, a ranger captain named John Coffee Jack Hayes was riding with about 15 men when roughly 75 Comanche warriors revealed themselves in a line across the open ground. By every rule of frontier warfare, Hayes and his men should have died there. The Comanche were the finest light cavalry on the continent, and the standard tactic against a single-shot rifleman was simple: draw his one bullet, then close while he reloaded. But Hayes's Rangers weren't carrying single-shot rifles. They were carrying Sam Colt's failed 5-shooters. Hayes wheeled his men and charged directly into the Comanche flank. And instead of one volley, the Rangers kept firing. 5 shots each, from horseback, at a range where a warrior had expected to find a man fumbling with a ramrod. It broke the Comanche line. When it was over, roughly 24 of their number lay dead on the ground, against a single ranger killed. It was the first time an entire company of Texas Rangers had taken Colt revolvers into a fight. And in his report, Hayes wrote a single sentence that would echo through firearms history: "I cannot recommend these arms too highly." Among the men riding with Hayes that day was a lean, quiet Marylander named Samuel Hamilton Walker. Born in 1817, he had come to Texas the way most Rangers did, looking for a war to be useful in. At Walker's Creek, he learned what a revolver could do in the hands of a man on horseback. He would not forget it. And Walker, of all men, knew exactly what it meant to be helpless. 2 years before Walker's Creek, Samuel Walker had ridden south with the ill-fated Muir expedition, a ragged Texan raid into Mexico. On December 26, 1842, after a brutal fight, he and more than 100 fellow Texans were captured and marched deep into enemy country as prisoners of war. They tried to escape. Most were recaptured. And Santa Anna's government decided to make an example of them. The punishment was a lottery. Into a clay pot went 159 white beans and 17 black ones. Each man was blindfolded and made to draw. A white bean meant you lived. A black bean meant you were shot. On the evening of March 25, 1843, the 17 men who had drawn black beans were allowed to write letters home, and then executed by firing squad. Samuel Walker drew a white bean. He was marched on to Mexico City and imprisoned in the stone dungeons of Perot Castle. He would eventually escape and make his way back to Texas, a man who had already been handed a death sentence by the draw of a bean and walked out the other side. So when Samuel Walker sat across from Samuel Colt and talked about what a fighting man needed to stay alive, he was not speaking in theory. He had counted the seconds between life and death with a blindfold over his eyes. He knew precisely what it was worth to never run out of shots. 2 years later, the United States went to war with Mexico, and Samuel Walker went with it. Now a captain in a regiment of U.S. mounted riflemen. In the winter of 1846, Army business carried him east on a recruiting trip. And in the east, Walker went looking for the one man who had built the gun that saved his life at Walker's Creek. Samuel Colt, out of the business for 4 years, had nothing to sell but an idea. What happened next was one of the most consequential conversations in the history of American arms. Walker didn't want the old Paterson. He wanted a war gun. He told Colt exactly what a mounted man needed: more shots, more power, and a design that wouldn't fail in a fight. Colt credited Walker directly with the improvements that followed: a fixed trigger protected by a guard, a heavier frame, 6 chambers instead of 5, and a caliber pushed up from the Paterson's small bore to a thunderous .44. They named it for the Ranger, the Walker Colt. In January of 1847, the U.S. government placed an order with Samuel Colt for 1,000 of these revolvers. There was only one problem. Colt didn't have a factory. He didn't have a single machine. He had a contract and a drawing. So he did the only thing he could. He took the order to Whitneyville, Connecticut, to the arms works run by Eli Whitney, Jr., son of the man who'd invented the cotton gin and had the guns built there. 1,100 were made in all, 1,000 for the Army and 100 more for the civilian market. And the gun they built was a monster. The Colt Walker weighed 4 pounds 9 ounces, heavier than most modern rifles' actions. It swallowed roughly 60 grains of black powder behind each ball, generating muzzle energy in the neighborhood of a modern .357 Magnum. From the day it was finished in 1847 until Smith & Wesson introduced the .357 Magnum in 1935, the Walker was the most powerful, commercially produced repeating handgun in the world. It held that title for 88 years. It was also, frankly, dangerous to its owner. The loading lever dropped under recoil and jammed the action. The cylinders, forged with the primitive metallurgy of the 1840s and sometimes overloaded, could rupture and burst. It was a brutal, half-tamed weapon. But it worked, and that 1,000-gun contract did something no amount of salesmanship had managed in a decade. It put Samuel Colt back in business. On the strength of the Walker order, Colt built his own factory in Hartford, Connecticut, and founded the company that would arm the American West for the next half-century. Colt learned from the Walker's faults, too. The very next year, he shrank and refined it into the Colt Dragoon, a lighter, safer .44 that fixed the dropping loading lever and the bursting cylinders, and went on to serve the U.S. cavalry for more than a decade. Every Colt that followed, the Dragoon, the Navy, and finally the single-action Peacemaker that men would come to call the gun that won the West, traces back through this one 4.5-pound pistol, designed by a Texas Ranger who had survived a firing squad lottery. Samuel Walker never saw what he'd built become. By most accounts, Colt sent him a pair of the new revolvers that bore his name. On October 9, 1847, the same year the gun was finished, Captain Samuel Hamilton Walker was killed leading a charge at the Battle of Huamantla in Mexico. He was 30 years old. He got his war gun. He did not get to grow old with it. Today, an original Colt Walker is one of the most valuable firearms on Earth. Surviving examples have sold for close to $1 million. Not because it was elegant. It wasn't. Not because it was safe. It wasn't that either. But because it was the gun that came out of a conversation between a failed inventor with nothing left to lose and a ranger who knew exactly what it felt like to be outnumbered and out of bullets. Between them, They built the weapon that tamed Texas and saved the man whose name is still stamped on revolvers today. 4.5 pounds, 6 shots. 88 years as the most powerful handgun alive. And it almost never got built. Chambered in history. If this one hit, there are more where it came from. A whole armory of them. Subscribe to Chambered in History and tell me in the comments, was the Walker a work of genius or a 4.5 pound accident that happened to work? Next time, the rifle that finished what the Walker started. Load up.